He didn't beg. He didn't argue. He just placed his employee badge on Victoria Hale's desk, looked her in the eye, and said, "I'll be back Monday." She had just fired him for knowing too much, for uncovering the boardroom conspiracy that would have stripped everything from her. He had no job, no paycheck, no guarantee. He had a 7-year-old daughter at home and a mortgage that didn't care about his principles. And he came back anyway. Not because he was reckless, because some things are worth more than security. This is the story of what loyalty looks like when it costs you everything. If this story moves you, drop a like and tell me in the comments. What city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The alarm went off at 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to. Evan Brooks lay there for a moment in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom he'd been sleeping in alone for 4 years, listening to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen and the distant sound of a truck somewhere on the highway 3 blocks over. He didn't reach for his phone right away. He gave himself those 13 minutes, not to sleep because he wasn't going to sleep, but just to be still before the day started grinding. By 5:15, he had coffee in a travel mug, a lunch packed for Lucy that she probably wouldn't eat half of, and a note left on the kitchen table in case she woke up before Mrs. Calloway came over to walk her to school. Leftover pasta in the blue container. Don't let her have juice before breakfast. Back by 6 at the latest. Dad. He'd been writing those notes for 2 years. Mrs. Calloway never mentioned them, but sometimes he came home to find them folded neatly on the counter instead of thrown away, and he didn't know what that meant and didn't ask. The drive to Westfield Regional was 22 minutes at this hour. He knew it the way he knew his own pulse. Every light, every pothole on the Route 9 overpass, the gas station that always had someone parked outside it at 5 a.m. no matter what day of the week. He'd been doing the overnight shift at the hospital for 3 years. Supply chain coordinator, which was a polite way of saying he tracked every bandage, IV bag, surgical glove, and pharmaceutical shipment that passed through the building and made sure none of it disappeared, ran short, or ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was not glamorous work. It paid $47,000 a year with benefits, and the benefits were the reason he'd stayed as long as he had. His wife Claire had died 4 years ago, 3 weeks after Lucy turned 3. Pulmonary embolism, sudden and complete. The doctors used the word massive, and Evan had always hated that word since massive storm, massive failure, massive loss. As if scale made it more comprehensible. She was there on a Tuesday and gone by Friday, and he'd spent 6 months afterward not entirely certain he was going to survive the grief, which was not a dramatic thought, but a practical one. He had a 3-year-old who needed breakfast and bath time, and someone to chase the shadows out of her room at night, and some mornings those were the only reasons he got out of bed. He got out of bed, that was the thing. He kept getting out of bed. But the night shifts were catching up to him. He could feel it in a way that wasn't just tiredness. It was a kind of slow erosion, like he was spending himself down to the last few dollars, and the account wasn't refilling. Lucy was 7 now, and she was starting to notice that her father looked tired in a way that didn't go away. She'd said something 2 weeks ago, casually, while he was helping her with a worksheet at the kitchen table. "Dad, your eyes look sad even when you're smiling." He'd told her he just needed more sleep. She'd given him the look, the one where she tilted her head slightly and blinked slowly, that was so much like Claire it sometimes knocked the air out of him. He needed to get off nights. That was the whole reason he'd applied to Pinnacle Access Solutions. He'd found the posting on a Thursday evening, sitting on the couch while Lucy watched a nature documentary about penguins with the volume too loud. Operations Coordinator, Accessibility Consulting. The salary was listed as $58,000 to $65,000, depending on experience. He'd almost scrolled past it because the phrase accessibility consulting meant nothing to him, and he assumed it was going to be some niche thing he had no background in. But he read the job description twice, and it was essentially logistics coordination and vendor management with an added layer of compliance tracking for ADA, regulations, and building code consulting services. He could do that. He'd been doing a version of that for 3 years in a hospital, which was arguably the most compliance-heavy environment outside of a nuclear plant. He applied that night after Lucy went to bed. He forgot about it by the following Monday. The callback came 11 days later. He almost didn't answer because he didn't recognize the number. The interview was conducted by a woman named Sandra Park, who was the company's HR director and seemed to be running some kind of efficiency study on the interview process itself. because she moved through questions at a pace that Evan found slightly disorienting but also oddly refreshing. No warm-up, no small talk, just tell me about a time you identified an operational problem before it became a crisis. He told her about the medication delivery tracking gap he'd caught at Westfield Regional, a routing error that would have shorted the ICU's insulin supply by 30% over a holiday weekend. He'd caught it on a Wednesday, 3 days before it would have become catastrophic. Sandra made a note and said, "The role reports directly to the CEO, Ms. Hale is—" She paused for a word. "Particular. Some people find her management style difficult." "How difficult?" Evan asked. 17% turnover in operations coordination over the past 2 years. He didn't respond to that right away. Then he said, "What's the industry average?" 11%. "And the people who stayed? Why did they stay?" Sandra looked at him for a moment. "I'll let you ask her that yourself," she said. He met Victoria Hale 6 days later. He'd done his research because he always did his research. Pinnacle Access Solutions had been founded 7 years ago by Victoria Hale and a business partner named Daniel Marsh. They'd built it into a firm with 34 employees and contracts with several mid-sized commercial real estate developers and 3 municipal governments, doing compliance audits and accessibility design consulting, the actual design and policy work, not just inspections. It was specialized enough to have low direct competition and general enough to scale significantly. 18 months ago, Daniel Marsh had left the company. The LinkedIn announcement called it a mutual decision to pursue different opportunities, which was the corporate language for something Evan couldn't pin down from public information. Victoria had since been the sole CEO. She was 30 years old. She'd been using a wheelchair for 2 years. He knew these things before he walked into the office. What he hadn't known, what you couldn't know from a website or a LinkedIn profile, was the way she looked at you when you first walked into a room. The Pinnacle office was in a converted 3-story building in the Garfield district, the kind of space that had been done up with enough exposed brick and oversized windows to feel intentional. The reception area was quiet on a Tuesday afternoon, and a young man named Marcus had walked Evan back through a corridor to the CEO's office, knocked twice, and then stepped aside in a way that suggested he preferred to maintain some distance from whatever happened next. Victoria Hale was at her desk, reading something on a tablet, and she didn't look up when Evan walked in. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, because there was clearly a chair there for that purpose, and he waited. The office was clean and spare, not minimalist in a designed way, more like she'd removed everything that wasn't load-bearing. One framed architectural drawing on the wall, some kind of public building. A standing whiteboard covered in process maps and timeline marks in different colors. A coffee mug with a crack running partway up the side that she was apparently still using. She set the tablet down and looked at him. She had dark hair pulled back, and her face was the kind of composed that you learn rather than inherit. The particular stillness of someone who has decided exactly how much of themselves they're willing to put where other people can see it. Her eyes were dark and sharp, and they moved over him in a way that wasn't rude, but wasn't warm either. Just assessment. "Your resume says you manage pharmaceutical supply chains," she said. Not a question. "Supply chain coordination at a regional hospital, yes." "That's not the same thing as pharmaceutical supply chain management." "No," he agreed. "I tracked and managed inbound logistics, vendor compliance, and distribution for all medical supply categories, including pharmaceuticals. The distinction you're drawing is fair." She seemed to find something mildly interesting about that answer, though her expression didn't change. "Sandra tells me you caught an insulin supply gap. Routing error in a third-party delivery schedule. It would have resolved itself eventually, but not before the ICU ran short over a long weekend. How did you catch it?" "I run the same cross-check every Wednesday." "It's not anything complicated. I just match incoming delivery confirmations against the standing order schedule and flag anything that doesn't reconcile. That week there was a discrepancy I'd seen the beginning of the week before, and it had gotten wider instead of smaller." "You created that cross-check yourself?" "It didn't exist when I started," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Why does this job interest you?" He'd prepared an answer about career growth and his interest in accessibility and compliance frameworks. He started to give it, and stopped himself about 2 sentences in, because she was already looking at him like she was waiting for him to stop. He said instead, "I work nights. My daughter is 7. I need to be home more." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not softening exactly, more like she'd registered something. "This role isn't easier than nights at a hospital," she said. "It's different. There will be weeks where you're here until 9 or 10. There will be unexpected crises and clients who call on weekends. If you're coming here for an easier schedule, you'll be disappointed." "I'm not looking for easier," he said. "I'm looking for a schedule I can predict. Night shift is 12 hours with a 3-hour window on either end where I'm transitional. My daughter gets me tired or she gets me asleep. I want her to get me present." Victoria said nothing for a long moment. Then she picked up the tablet again and made a note on something, and Evan couldn't tell if that was good or bad. "I'll be direct," she said, not looking up. "I've had 4 coordinators in 2.5 years. The first one left because she said I was too demanding. The second one left because he couldn't handle the pace. The third one I fired for cutting corners on a compliance report. The fourth one quit by email on a Friday afternoon." She set the tablet down and looked at him again. "I'm not interested in interviewing again in 6 months. If you take this role and it doesn't work, I need to know you'll tell me that directly instead of disappearing. And if it does work, then you'll have a job for as long as you want one," she said, and the simplicity of it was almost startling. He got an offer letter the following Monday. What? His first week at Pinnacle was the kind of overwhelming that had a shape to it. Not chaos, but density. There were systems, but they were imperfectly documented, and the documentation that existed was frequently out of date. There were vendor relationships that operated on informal understandings that nobody had written down because they'd assumed the relationship would continue, and nobody had planned for the eventuality that the person holding the understanding in their head might leave. There were 3 active municipal projects in different phases with compliance deadlines that were tracked in 2 separate systems that did not speak to each other, and Evan spent most of his first week building a bridge between them in a spreadsheet that he knew was not a permanent solution, but was at least a surface he could stand on while he figured out what the permanent solution should be. On Friday of that first week, Victoria stopped by the open workspace where he sat, glanced at what was on his screen without comment, and said, "The Millbrook project deadline is November 4th. The vendor contact for the lift installation is Gary Thorin. He's late delivering. He's been late on every project. Nobody has called him on it because the previous coordinator thought it was the project manager's job, and the project manager thought it was the coordinator's job." "Who's right?" Evan asked. "I don't care who's right," she said, already moving. "Fix it." He called Gary Thorin that afternoon. The conversation was not pleasant. Gary was the kind of vendor who had gotten comfortable with vague timelines because nobody had required better. Evan didn't threaten and didn't apologize. He just laid out the timeline, named the milestone date, and said clearly that if the lift components weren't on site by October 24th, Pinnacle would need to document the delay and its consequences for the client record, which would affect the vendor relationship going forward. Gary said he'd see what he could do. The components arrived October 23rd. Evan didn't mention any of this to Victoria. She found out anyway from the project manager's update report. She didn't say anything to him directly, but on Monday morning, he arrived to find that his system access had been expanded to include 2 additional project databases that he'd been waiting on requests for, and the requests had been approved over the weekend. That was how she operated. Not with praise, not with explanation, with access. He was starting to understand the shape of her. Lucy asked about his job on a Thursday evening while he was making dinner. She was at the kitchen counter on a stool, drawing something that appeared to be a horse with extremely large feet, and she said without looking up, "Is your boss nice?" "She's..." He paused, thinking about it honestly. "She's very direct." "Is that good?" "I think so," he said. "I'd rather know where I stand." "Mrs. Feliciano is direct," Lucy said. Feliciano was her second-grade teacher and a figure who existed somewhere between admiration and mild terror in Lucy's worldview. She told Tyler that his story didn't make sense, and he had to start over. He cried. That's harsh. He did start over, though, and the new one was better. Lucy held up the drawing and examined it. "I think my horse has too many legs." "How many does it have?" She counted. 5. "Horses have 4. "I know," she said, and went back to drawing, apparently unbothered. "How was your day, Dad?" He told her about a vendor compliance form that had generated a small crisis and then resolved itself, simplifying the parts that wouldn't translate to a 7-year-old's frame of reference. And she listened with the attentiveness she gave most things, complete and slightly distracted at the same time, in a way that reminded him of himself. When he was done, she said, "That sounds annoying, but okay." "Yeah," he said, "that's about right." He turned back to the stove. Outside, the October dark was coming down early, and through the kitchen window he could see the neighbor's maple had lost another third of its leaves since the weekend. The apartment smelled like garlic and pasta and something warm he couldn't name exactly, and Lucy was back to drawing her 5-legged horse, and he stood at the stove thinking that this, just this, ordinary and unspectacular, was what he'd been working toward all those early mornings and 12-hour nights. He hadn't fixed anything yet. He was barely 3 weeks into a new job with a boss who kept her own counsel and a company that was running on informal knowledge and a prayer. He was 32 years old and exhausted in the specific way of someone who has been holding things together by will for too long. But the nights were his own again. That had to count for something. The second month was harder than the first, which Evan hadn't anticipated. He'd assumed that once he understood the systems, or built the ones that were missing, the job would settle into a rhythm he could manage. What he hadn't accounted for was Victoria. Not her demands exactly, because the demands were consistent and at least followed a logic he could track. What he hadn't accounted for was the way she kept moving the line. The first time it happened, he thought it was a mistake. He'd submitted a vendor performance summary for the Millbrook project, 12 pages, clean, everything cross-referenced against the contract terms and the delivery records he'd been consolidating since his first week. He sent it to her on a Thursday afternoon and got a reply at 7:43 that evening. "The summary is adequate. The analysis is thin. Why did Thorne's delay pattern start in August and not before?" He stared at the email for a moment. The summary wasn't supposed to include a root cause analysis. Nobody had asked for one. He wrote back. "The scope of the summary was performance against contract terms. If you want a root cause analysis, I can have one to you by Monday." She replied within 4 minutes. "Why would I tell you what I want when you can already see what's missing?" He sat with that for a while. Then he pulled the delivery records back up and spent Friday evening, Lucy asleep, apartment quiet, tracing Thorne's timelines back 14 months. He found that the delay pattern began precisely after Thorne had taken on a large contract with a regional hospital network in August, which had quietly become his priority account. Evan wrote it up in 3 paragraphs, sent it Saturday morning, and went to make breakfast. Victoria didn't respond until Monday. Her reply was 2 words, better. Continue. That was the pattern. She never told him what she was looking for. She told him when what he'd produced was insufficient, and she expected him to figure out the gap himself. The first time it felt like a trap. The second time, it felt like a test. By the 5th or 6th time, Evan realized it wasn't either. It was just how her mind worked. She processed information the way a surgeon operated, identifying the deficiency first and then waiting to see if the other person could find it too. If you brought her the right answer without being told to look for it, she moved on. If you brought her something incomplete, she named the gap and waited again. It was exhausting. It was also, he grudgingly admitted to himself one evening while driving home, the most intellectually engaged he'd been at work in years. What made it harder was that she wasn't consistent in any way that allowed him to relax. Some days she was in her office by 7 and gone by 4, and those days the office had a different atmosphere, productive but lighter, like something barometric had shifted. Other days she arrived at 9 and was still there when Evan left at 6:30. And on those days she moved through the space with a focused intensity that everyone around her seemed to absorb and reflect back at slightly higher voltage. She never raised her voice, she didn't need to. She asked questions in a tone that was level and precise, and somehow made you feel the full weight of not having the answer ready. Marcus, the front desk coordinator who had been at Pinnacle for 2 years and knew where everything was buried, told Evan at lunch one day, "You're doing better than the last 3. How long did they last? Kessler made it 4 months. Huang lasted 8, which is the record. Petrov quit by email. Sandra mentioned that, Evan said. She email quit at 2 in the morning, which tells you something about the state of mind she was in by the end. Marcus unwrapped his sandwich. Not that Victoria's wrong about things. She's almost never wrong about the work stuff. It's just, she doesn't give you anything to hold on to, you know? Like, you do good work and it just goes into the machine and you never know if you're okay or one step from the door. Evan knew what Marcus meant. He just wasn't sure it bothered him the same way. He'd worked in a hospital overnight for 3 years, where the feedback loop was either an error that cost someone something they couldn't get back, or a silence that meant nothing had gone wrong. He was used to operating without affirmation. It wasn't comfortable, but it was familiar. What he did find difficult, and didn't say to Marcus, was the thing he'd started to notice around week 6, the way Victoria occasionally looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Not with warmth, not with anything he could name exactly, more like wariness, like someone standing close to something they hadn't decided yet whether to trust. He didn't mention it because he wasn't sure he was reading it right, and he'd learned by then that with Victoria Hale, guessing was more dangerous than waiting. 2. The thing about single parenthood that nobody tells you, or that everybody tells you and you don't fully understand until you're in it, is that it's not one hard thing. It's 40 small hard things that happen simultaneously, and each one is manageable on its own, and together they're just the texture of every day. By November, Evan had worked out a schedule that technically functioned. Mrs. Calloway took Lucy to school 3 mornings a week. His neighbor, a retired teacher named Pat Doherty, who had known Claire and seemed to have quietly decided to keep an eye on Evan afterward, picked Lucy up on Tuesdays. On Thursdays, Pinnacle allowed him to work remotely until noon, which let him do the school drop-off himself, which Lucy had strong feelings about. "You have to walk me to the gate," she told him on the first Thursday. "Not just the sidewalk. The gate's an extra 4 minutes. Dad." He walked her to the gate. The remote Thursdays were his favorite part of the new job, in a way that had nothing to do with the work itself. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and his coffee, and Lucy's leftover drawing supplies scattered at the far end, and he did the same work he would have done at the office, except that he could hear the building's pipes and the occasional pigeon on the window ledge, and the ambient sound of a neighborhood moving through its morning. It was an ordinary thing that he hadn't had for years, and he was quietly, almost embarrassingly grateful for it. Lucy, for her part, had moved on from 5-legged horses to elaborate maps. She drew maps of places she invented. Not fantasy places with dragons, but ordinary-seeming places with schools and libraries and a bakery that was always open. She named streets after things she liked. Evan found one with a street called Pasta Avenue that ran through the middle of a neighborhood called Quiet Town. "Who lives in Quiet Town?" he asked her one evening. "People who aren't too loud," she said. "That's a short list." "You could live there," she said, with the confidence of someone bestowing a compliment. "You're pretty quiet." "I talk plenty." "Not when you're thinking," she said. "When you're thinking, you just make that face." "What face?" She demonstrated. It was remarkably accurate. He had not thought much about the fact that his daughter knew him well enough to do that, and the thought sat with him in a way that was warm and slightly complicated. The first time Victoria tested him in a way that felt less like a work assessment and more like something else, it was the second week of November. He'd stayed late to finalize a deliverable for the Hargrove Municipal Project, a compliance gap analysis that needed to go to the client the following morning. Victoria was still in her office when he wrapped up around 7:15, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that she appeared in the doorway of the open workspace as he was shutting down his laptop and said, "The Hargrove report. Did you flag the elevator shaft clearance issue?" He had. It was on page 4, subsection 2.3, with a code reference and a cost estimate range for the remediation. "Page 4, he said. "The client is going to push back on the remediation cost." "Probably." "How are you going to handle it?" He looked at her. "How do you want me to handle it?" "I want to know how you plan to handle it," she said. "This is your project now." He hadn't known that. Sandra hadn't told him, and Victoria hadn't either until this moment, at 7:15 on a Tuesday with his coat half on. "Okay," he said after a beat. "I'll walk them through the code requirement first. If the requirement is non-negotiable, which it is, then the conversation about cost is really a conversation about timeline and scope sequencing, not whether to do it. I'd give them 3 remediation pathways with different cost profiles and let them feel like they're making a decision." Victoria looked at him without expression for a moment. Then she said, "Don't phrase it as 'let them feel.' They are making a decision. The pathways are real." "You're right," he said. "I'll fix that framing." She nodded, which was the equivalent, he was learning, of someone else saying good job. Then she turned and went back into her office, and Evan finished putting on his coat and went home. He didn't understand the full significance of the exchange until 2 days later when he got an email from Marcus telling him that his nameplate had been updated in the project management system as the lead coordinator of record for Hargrove. No announcement, no conversation, just a change in the system, quiet and done. He thought about going to her office and saying something. He decided not to. He just updated his working files with the new designation and sent a brief acknowledgement email to the Hargrove project manager, introducing himself formally in that capacity. Victoria replied to the chain, not to him directly, but to the whole thread, with 3 words, "Mr. Brooks handles this," which was not a compliment, but felt like one. Tess. He found out about Daniel Marsh by accident. He hadn't been looking for it. He'd been digging through the old project archive files, trying to understand a contract structure for a current client that appeared to reference a previous agreement, and he came across a folder labeled DM Exit/Transition that hadn't been properly archived and was sitting in the active project directory. He didn't open it. He flagged it to Marcus to get it moved to the correct location. Marcus went very still when Evan mentioned it. "Just move it to the archive, right?" Evan said. "Yeah," Marcus said, not meeting his eyes. "Yeah, I'll take care of it." That evening, Evan looked up what he could find about Daniel Marsh, which wasn't much beyond what he'd already seen. There was a LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in 16 months. A mention in a trade publication about a firm he'd started after leaving Pinnacle, which appeared to have folded within a year. No public dispute record, no litigation filings he could find with a basic search. He mentioned it to no one, but a week later he was working late again, Pushtown, later than he intended, past 8. And he passed Victoria's office, and the door was half open, and he heard something he wasn't supposed to hear. She was on the phone, and her voice had a quality it never had in professional contexts, something raw, like a frequency she kept turned down during business hours. He only caught a fragment before he moved past. "Don't tell me it wasn't personal, because leaving the week after the surgery was about as personal as it gets." He kept walking. He didn't slow down, didn't pause, didn't let on that he'd heard it, and when he passed her office the next morning, she was exactly as she always was, composed and precise and entirely unreadable. But he kept that fragment in the back of his mind and let it rearrange a few things he thought he'd understood about her. A fiancé. That's what he filled in, not from evidence, but from the way those words had sounded. The surgery, the accident, whatever had happened 2 years ago, and someone who had left not just the company, but her, in the same window of time. And she had continued. She had run the company through whatever that was, managed the transition from 2 founders to 1, restructured the business, sustained the client relationships, hired and fired and hired again. That took a particular kind of stubbornness that Evan recognized because he had a version of it himself. The kind that isn't bravery so much as refusal. Refusal to let the thing that broke you be the thing that defines what's possible afterward. He didn't say any of this to her. It wasn't his to say. Lucy met Victoria in December, and it was not planned. The Friday afternoon before winter break, Evan's school notification app went sideways. He still wasn't sure how, and he missed the message that Lucy's after-school program had closed early due to a burst pipe in the building's boiler room. He got the automated follow-up call at 3:47 while he was in a meeting with Victoria and 2 clients reviewing a Phase 2 compliance proposal. He excused himself into the hallway, called the school, confirmed that Lucy was in the front office and fine, and came back in to discover that Victoria had continued the meeting and was calmly redirecting a question back to the clients without missing a step. He leaned in and said quietly, "I'm sorry. I need to leave. My daughter's school had an emergency." Victoria looked at him, and then at the clients. "We'll pick this up next week. Marcus will send the revised schedule." And she wrapped the meeting in 90 seconds with a professionalism that the client seemed to find entirely natural. In the lobby afterward, she said, "Is she all right?" "She's fine. Burst pipe. She's in the front office." "You should go." "I know. I'm sorry about the meeting." "The meeting will happen again," Victoria said. "Go." He went. He got to the school 20 minutes later and found Lucy sitting in the front office reading a library book she'd had the foresight to bring, completely unbothered, eating a granola bar that the school secretary had given her. She looked up when he came in and said, "The pipe made a very loud noise." "Were you scared?" A little. Then it was just wet. She held up the book. I got to chapter 9. He drove her back to the office because he had one thing left to finish before he could call it a day. The revised language on the Hargrove remediation pathways, which he'd promised to send by 5. He told Lucy it would be 20 minutes, set her up with her book at the small conference table in the hallway, and went to his desk. 12 minutes later, he heard voices. He got up and looked into the hallway. Lucy was standing next to Victoria's wheelchair. Victoria had come out for something, the printer perhaps, which was down the hall. And Lucy was looking at the wheelchair with the frank curiosity she brought to most things. "Does it go fast?" she was asking. Victoria regarded her. "Not particularly." "My friend Marcus has a scooter. He says speed is the whole point." "Marcus is talking about a different kind of scooter." Lucy considered this. Then, "Does your back hurt?" "My dad's back hurts when he sits too long. He makes a sound." Evan closed his eyes briefly. "What kind of sound?" Victoria asked, and Evan could not fully read her tone, whether it was amusement or something more careful. "Like when you're disappointed but you don't want to say," Lucy said. A pause. "Your father makes a sound like that?" "Only when he thinks I'm not listening." Lucy tilted her head. "He thinks I don't notice things, but I notice things." "I believe you," Victoria said. Evan came out into the hallway at that point, because he'd decided the conversation had gone far enough in whatever direction it was going. "Lucy, I told you to stay at the table." "I did stay, then I didn't." "That's not how staying works." Lucy looked at Victoria as if inviting her to weigh in on the matter. Victoria said nothing, but there was something at the edge of her expression that, on anyone else, Evan would have called a suppressed smile. "Sorry," Evan said to her. "She's fine," Victoria said. She looked at Lucy for a moment more, a real look, not dismissive. And then she turned and went back to her office. Lucy watched her go. "She seems sad," she said quietly. "She's just private," Evan said. Lucy thought about that. "Those aren't the same thing," she said. He didn't argue with her. He went back to his desk and finished the Hargrove revisions and tried not to think about the fact that his 7-year-old had just said the truest thing about Victoria Hale that he'd heard since he started working there. Tugged. The dinners started as an accident, too. Victoria had come to the office on a Saturday in mid-December. Evan had come in for 3 hours to finish a quarterly compliance filing that had a Monday deadline. And when he was leaving, he nearly ran into her in the parking lot. She'd apparently been there since morning. He said he was picking Lucy up and getting food somewhere, the way you say something meaningless to fill the space of a goodbye. And Victoria said without apparent planning, "Where?" He blinked. "Marco's probably. She likes the pasta." A pause. "I haven't eaten," Victoria said, which was not exactly an acceptance and not exactly not one. He called Lucy and added the caveat, and Lucy said, "Okay," with the breezy acceptance of a child who doesn't yet understand when something is unusual. Marco's was a family restaurant 12 blocks from the office. Red booze, bread basket you didn't have to ask for, a laminated menu with pictures. Not the kind of place Evan would have imagined taking his boss. But Victoria navigated the entrance without difficulty, and the hostess seated them without making anything of it, and Lucy immediately opened the menu and began examining it with the concentration of someone evaluating a legal document. "The gnocchi," Lucy announced. "Definitely." "You always get the gnocchi," Evan said, "because it's always the right choice." She looked at Victoria. "What do you like?" "I haven't been here before." "The gnocchi," Lucy said immediately. Victoria looked at the menu. "I'll consider it." She ordered the gnocchi. The dinner lasted an hour and 40 minutes, which was longer than any of them had apparently intended. Lucy did most of the talking for the first 30 minutes, which was normal, and then the conversation fell into a rhythm that Evan couldn't quite explain afterward. Neither professional nor personal, but some third thing that had properties of both. Victoria asked Lucy about her maps. Lucy explained the geography of Quiet Town in detail, including the zoning regulations she'd invented, which made Victoria ask a question about the placement of the library relative to the residential zone that was so specific it caught Evan off guard. "You know about zoning?" he asked. "I work in building access compliance," she said. "Zoning is half the job." "I meant that you were asking a 7-year-old about it." Victoria looked at him. She brought it up. I did, Lucy confirmed. I was explaining about the library placement, and she said that in real zoning there's a setback requirement, and I didn't know what that was. What did you tell her? Evan asked Victoria. The truth, that it's a minimum distance between a building and a property line, and it exists partly for safety and partly for aesthetics, and sometimes the two things conflict. She picked up her water glass. She asked good follow-up questions. Evan looked at his daughter, who was arranging the remnants of her gnocchi into a pattern with her fork and paying no attention to either of them. Lucy, he said. You asked good follow-up questions. I know, she said serenely. He drove Victoria back to her car in the Pinnacle lot afterward. She said thank you, which she said in the same tone she used for everything, level and precise, but which sounded different in that context, in the dark of the parking lot with December cold coming off the pavement. Thank you for the gnocchi recommendation, she said, which was aimed at the back seat. Lucy's voice came back. It's never wrong. Victoria got out of the car and into her own vehicle without difficulty. Evan waited until she'd driven out of the lot before pulling away. She smiled, Lucy said. I didn't see that. That's because you were watching the road. A pause. She has a sad smile, like she forgot how to do a regular one. Evan kept his eyes on the road. Outside, the city moved past in its December dark, strings of holiday lights on the storefronts, a few people walking fast with their coats pulled up. Maybe she's just out of practice, he said. Maybe, Lucy said, and went back to looking out the window. That dinner became the template, though none of them ever said so explicitly. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in early January, Victoria mentioned offhandedly that she was going to be near Marco's around 6. Evan said they'd probably be there around then too, which was true. Lucy's response, when told, was, Good. I need to explain the new neighborhood I'm designing. It has a better library. The third dinner was suggested by Lucy directly, who texted Evan from Pat Doherty's phone. Because Lucy didn't have a phone but had apparently decided this was a situation requiring communication, saying, Can Victoria come to Marco's this Saturday? I think she should. Lucy. He showed the message to Victoria on Thursday afternoon, sliding his phone across his desk without comment. She read it. She handed the phone back. She said, Saturday works. And that was how it started. Not with any declaration or decision, but the way most real things start, with one small yes and then another, until you look up and realize you're somewhere new without being able to name the exact moment you arrived. By late January, Evan had been at Pinnacle 3 months, and he knew the company well enough to see the things that Victoria couldn't see from where she sat. Not because she was inattentive, Victoria was the most attentive person he'd ever worked for, but because there were angles you couldn't see from the center of something you'd built yourself. He saw the way certain senior staff deferred to her in meetings and then ran different plays when she wasn't in the room. He saw the way 2 board members who occasionally came through the office looked at her wheelchair before they looked at her face, and how they adjusted their tone in a way they probably didn't notice themselves doing. He saw the way the operations budget had been structured to minimize visible expenditures in categories the board reviewed directly, which was smart management, but also suggested Victoria had learned she needed to justify things that other CEOs simply didn't. He filed these observations away. He didn't know what to do with all of them yet. Some of them were just the texture of any workplace. Some of them felt like something else, like the early signs of a pattern, the way a delivery delay that's 2 days becomes 5. Becomes a systemic problem if you're not watching. He was watching. Victoria didn't know that yet either. She trusted his work, he thought, in the particular way she trusted things, provisionally, with constant verification, through the mechanism of not having told him to stop. He was still being tested, probably. He didn't mind. He'd learned something in those 3 months about what her tests were actually measuring, and it wasn't competence. Competence she could verify from a spreadsheet. What she was measuring, he thought, was something closer to consistency. Not whether he could perform when things were easy, but whether he showed up the same way when things were complicated, when he was tired, when the task wasn't clearly his, when nobody was looking. He showed up the same way, not because he was trying to pass a test, but because he didn't really have another mode. He'd been showing up the same way for 4 years. For Lucy, for the overnight hospital shifts, for the small daily decisions that nobody noticed, but that added up to the person you actually were. He wasn't going to be different at a new job. One evening in late January, he was reviewing a vendor contract at his desk after most people had left, and Victoria came by on her way out. She paused. "You're still here," she said. 20 minutes more." She looked at the screen. "The Kellner contract?" "Something's off in the indemnity clause. It might be nothing." She didn't move for a moment. "Send me what you find." "I will." She started toward the elevator. Then she stopped. She didn't turn around when she said it. "You've been here 3 months." "Yes." "I've had to correct your work twice." He thought about it. "The Hargrove framing? The August variance on the Millbrook report?" "Yes." A pause. "That's fewer corrections than most people need in a first week." Then she continued to the elevator and the doors closed, and Evan sat at his desk alone with the Kellner contract open on his screen, and he didn't think too much about what she'd said, because thinking too much about it would have made him self-conscious in a way that would have changed something about how he worked. He found the issue in the indemnity clause 20 minutes later. It was small, a scope definition that was subtly broader than the service terms warranted, enough to create liability exposure in an edge case. He sent her the flagged clause with a 3-sentence explanation at 7:52 p.m. She replied at 8:09, "Fix it before the signing on Thursday. Good catch." He closed his laptop, put on his coat, and drove home in the January cold to an apartment where Lucy had left a drawing on the kitchen table. A new neighborhood map, more complex than the last one, with a street in the northwest corner labeled Brooks Avenue. He stood there a moment looking at it. Then he went to make dinner because it was late and he hadn't eaten, and the map would be there when he was done. And some things you didn't need to make into a whole thing. You just let them be what they were. The thing about a conspiracy, Evan would think later, is that it doesn't look like one from the inside. It looks like normal business. It looks like people having reasonable concerns expressed through appropriate channels. It looks like caution, even care. The malice is in the structure, not the surface. And if you don't know what you're looking at, you can watch the whole thing unfold and think you're seeing something else entirely. He started seeing it in February. Not all at once. It came in fragments, small things, the kind that don't mean anything individually and only acquire weight when you hold enough of them together. The first fragment was a board meeting he wasn't supposed to know the details of. Pinnacle's board met quarterly. Evan was not a board-level employee and had no direct access to board materials, which was entirely appropriate. But he processed the operational reports that fed into board presentations, which meant he saw the data before it was packaged, and he knew which numbers were being emphasized and which were being presented in ways that required context to interpret correctly. In February, he prepared the Q4 vendor performance summary as requested, sent it to Victoria, and thought nothing more of it. 2 days later, he got a request from a man named Richard Colton, a senior board member whose name Evan knew from org charts but had never spoken with directly, for a separate summary covering only the remediation cost overruns from the past 18 months. It was an unusual request, not inappropriate. A board member had the authority to request operational data, but the framing was specific in a way that felt pointed. Cost overruns, not cost performance, not budget variance. Overruns implied mismanagement before the data had been looked at. Evan prepared the summary as requested, flagged the request to Victoria in a brief email. FYI, Colton requested this directly, sending you a copy, and noted internally that the summary, read without context, would look worse than the actual performance record warranted. Victoria's reply was brief. "Thank you for the heads up. Send it." He sent it. And he kept the flagged request in a folder he'd labeled, without much forethought, items of note. The second fragment was Trevor Salas. Salas was Pinnacle's VP of Business Development, which put him 2 levels below Victoria and theoretically in a peer relationship with Evan, though Salas clearly did not see it that way. He was 37, well-dressed in the manner of someone who considered appearance part of the professional toolkit, and he had been at the company for 4 years. Long enough to have survived 2 complete turnovers of the operations coordination role, which meant he knew where everything was buried and was aware of the power that knowledge represented. Evan had no particular issue with Salas in the early months. He was smooth and competent and not especially warm, but none of those things were problems by themselves. What Evan started noticing in February was the way Salas moved, specifically who he talked to, when, and where. Salas had lunch twice in 3 weeks with Richard Colton, not at the office, at restaurants on the other side of downtown. Evan only knew because Marcus mentioned it in passing, the way Marcus mentioned everything, in the tone of someone noting weather. He also noticed that Salas had begun CCing board members directly on client correspondence in cases where the standard routing went through Victoria's office first. Not always. Not in a pattern obvious enough to call out. Just often enough that the board was receiving information in Salas's framing before Victoria could provide her own. Evan thought about this for a week before he did anything. Then, on a Thursday evening, when the office was mostly empty, he pulled the board communication logs from the internal system, to which he had access as operations coordinator, and spent 2 hours reading them with the same careful attention he brought to vendor delivery records. What he found was a pattern. Salas's direct board communications had increased by roughly 60% over the prior quarter. The content was professionally appropriate: client updates, market notes, industry articles. But the effect, cumulatively, was that Salas had become a voice in the board's ear that operated parallel to and increasingly independent of the CEO. That alone was not proof of anything. What he found next was caught. The document was in a shared drive folder that was theoretically restricted to senior management, which should not have included Evan. But the folder permissions had been set up by the previous operations coordinator and had never been properly audited, which meant Evan had access that he probably wasn't supposed to have and that nobody had thought to remove. He discovered this by accident when searching for a client file that had been misfiled, and the search returned a result from a folder called Governance/Board Planning. He almost closed it without looking. He didn't, because the file name caught his eye. Leadership Transition, Preliminary Framework. It was a 15-page document authored by Trevor Salas, dated 3 weeks prior. It outlined, in the careful and euphemistic language of corporate strategy, a proposal for restructuring Pinnacle's leadership. The word restructuring appeared 11 times. The phrase operational continuity concerns appeared 7 times. The phrase current leadership limitations appeared 4 times, each time in a context that made clear the limitations being referenced were not operational, but physical, though the document was careful never to say so directly. It used phrases like bandwidth constraints and capacity for full executive engagement and the demands of the role in its current scope. Victoria's name appeared once in a section titled Transition Considerations, where the document recommended a dignified transition structure that would allow her to remain involved in an advisory or ambassador capacity while executive authority transferred to a restructured leadership team. Salas's name appeared as the proposed interim CEO. Evan read the document twice. He was aware while reading it of a specific kind of anger. Not hot, but cold. The kind that sharpens rather than blurs your thinking. He'd felt it before, in smaller doses, when he encountered institutional systems that functioned by disadvantaging people in ways that were structurally designed to look like something other than what they were. He saved a copy to his personal secure drive. He closed the folder. He went home, made dinner, listened to Lucy talk about a book she was reading, helped her with a math worksheet, and after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold and thought carefully about what came next. The thing was, he couldn't go to Victoria with a document he'd accessed through a permission error. He'd been in the right place to find it, but the finding of it was complicated, and he needed to be able to explain how he knew what he knew without undermining the credibility of the information itself. He also couldn't go to the board. He had no relationship with the board, and a junior coordinator walking into a governance dispute would accomplish nothing except making him easier to dismiss. He needed evidence that was clean, independently discoverable, things he could point to without having to explain a file he shouldn't have been able to open. He started building the file on a Friday night in February, after Lucy was in bed. He labeled it Governance Review, Operations Perspective in his personal drive, which was a title so boring that nobody would look twice at it. He found the first clean thread through Colton's data request. He'd held on to the original request language, and he went back to it now with the document in mind. The phrasing, cost overruns, prior 18 months, was specific in a way that would produce a particular result when presented to a board without context. Cost overruns in a compliance consulting firm often reflected scope changes on the client side, not management failures. But to someone unfamiliar with the industry, The word overrun implied the latter. Evan built a comparative analysis, voluntary, unasked for, that contextualized every cost variance in the prior 18 months against the project records, showing which overruns were initiated by client scope changes, which were vendor delivery failures, and which, if any, were attributable to internal forecasting errors. There were 3 in the last category, all minor, none exceeding 2% of project budget. He put it in the file without sending it anywhere. Then he started pulling Salas's board communications through the internal log, building a timeline. He documented the escalation pattern, the frequency increase, the routing change, the parallel channel, all from data he had legitimate access to as the operations coordinator. He didn't interpret the data in the document, he just presented the sequence. That too went into the file. The harder thing, the thing that took him 3 weeks and several evenings he should have been sleeping through, was building the full picture of what Victoria had actually done with Pinnacle in the 2 years since the accident. He pulled every available metric: client retention rates, contract values, project completion timelines, compliance audit pass rates, staff tenure in non-operations roles, revenue trajectory. He pulled the industry benchmarks he could find through public sources and professional association databases, and he mapped Pinnacle's performance against them. What he found was not a company in decline under struggling leadership. What he found was a company that had grown its annual contract value by 31% in 2 years, maintained a client retention rate 12 points above the industry average, and expanded its municipal contract portfolio from 3 to 7 engagements. Under Victoria Hale, working alone after her business partner left, and while managing a significant physical recovery, Pinnacle had not just survived. It had become materially stronger. He sat with those numbers for a long time. He thought about the way Colton had phrased his data request. He thought about capacity for full executive engagement and bandwidth constraints. He thought about the way board members looked at Victoria's wheelchair before they looked at her face, and he felt the cold anger again, cleaner now, because he had something to put behind it. He told none of this to Victoria. This was, he knew, a complicated choice. She had a right to know. But he also knew enough about her by now to understand that if he brought her incomplete information, she would act on it immediately and in a way that might foreclose options that were still open. Victoria's instinct under threat was to meet it directly, which was one of her strengths and also, in this particular situation, a vulnerability. A direct confrontation with the board, without the full evidence assembled, without the counter-narrative built, would be exactly the kind of thing that could be framed as erratic behavior in an already poisoned room. He needed more time. He kept working. What he hadn't planned for was that Salas was also watching him. He didn't realize it at first. There was nothing overt. Salas was too careful for that. But in early March, Evan noticed that his access to the shared project drive had been reduced. Not eliminated, just narrowed, certain folders now requiring an additional authorization step that hadn't been there before. He submitted a routine access review request through Sandra's office, the standard procedure, and it came back 2 days later marked under review. That had never happened before. Standard access requests resolved in 24 hours. He noted it. He didn't push. Then a client called, the Hargrove project manager, a woman named Denise Fujiwara, who Evan had developed a solid working relationship with over 3 months, and said, in the careful tone of someone saying something they weren't entirely comfortable saying, "I got a call from someone at your office, a Trevor Salas. He said there might be leadership changes at Pinnacle and wanted to know if Hargrove would be interested in discussing a direct contract modification." Evan was quiet for a moment. "When did he call?" "Tuesday." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd wait to hear from you or Victoria." A pause. "I thought you should know." "I appreciate it," he said. "There are no leadership changes affecting your project. I'll follow up in writing today." He sent the written follow-up to Denise. Then he wrote a detailed memo to himself about the call, time-stamped, and added it to the file. Salas was not just building toward a board vote. He was already working the clients, which meant the timeline Evan had assumed he had was shorter than he'd thought. He told Victoria on a Tuesday evening in mid-March. He hadn't planned the timing. He'd planned to wait until the file was more complete, until he had enough to be unambiguous. But that afternoon he had been pulled into an unscheduled meeting by Sandra, who looked uncomfortable in a way she usually managed to conceal, and informed that as of the following Friday, his role was being restructured, a word he now had a very clear understanding of, and that a transitional severance package would be provided. He asked who had authorized the restructuring. Sandra said, "It came from above my level, Evan. I'm sorry." He went back to his desk and spent the rest of the afternoon finishing the documentation he had. At 6:15, after everyone else had gone, he knocked on Victoria's office door. She was at her desk. She looked at him, and something in his face told her to put down what she was holding. "I need to show you something," he said. He sat across from her and opened his laptop and walked her through it. All of it. The Colton data request and the framing analysis, the board communication timeline, the performance data comparison, the Hargrove call, and finally, the summary he'd built without mentioning how he'd known to look in the first place. He left the Solace document out of it. Everything he showed her was verifiable through channels she could access herself. She didn't interrupt him. She sat very still in the way she sat when she was doing her most focused thinking, and she looked at each thing he put in front of her with the same careful attention she gave everything. When he finished, the office was quiet. "How long have you been building this?" she asked. "About 6 weeks?" "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "Because I needed it to be complete enough that you couldn't be dismissed," he said. "If I'd come to you with half of this, you would have confronted it immediately, and there wasn't enough yet to be unambiguous." She looked at him. "You made a decision about what I could handle." "I made a decision about timing," he said, "not about what you could handle. I know what you can handle." A pause. She looked at the screen again. The Hargrove contact. Solace called Denise Fujiwara directly. I have her account of the call in writing. He's already working the client base. Yes. Her expression didn't change, not in any obvious way, but there was something in the set of her jaw that shifted, something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between them, in the place where you process betrayal when you've been through enough of it that you recognize it before it's finished arriving. "I'm being terminated Friday," Evan said. Her eyes came back to his. "I know. You knew." "I was told this afternoon that an operations restructuring was being recommended." Her voice was level. "I was told it originated from board guidance. I was not told your name specifically." "Did you push back?" "I was given 30 minutes notice before my 5 o'clock call." She looked at him. "I didn't have what you have in front of me yet." He nodded. He closed the laptop. "I'm going to keep working on this," he said. "After Friday." She went very still. "You'll be terminated." "I know. You have a daughter. You have a mortgage." "I know that too. Evan." It was the first time she'd used his first name in a context that wasn't purely logistical, and the shift of it changed the texture of the sentence in a way he felt more than analyzed. "I'm not asking you to do that." "I know you're not asking," he said. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do." She looked at him for a long time, the kind of look where you're not examining the surface of a person but trying to see through it to the thing underneath, checking whether what you're seeing is real or a version of something you've been fooled by before. He let her look. He had nothing to hide in that moment. "Why?" she asked finally, quietly. He thought about the true answer, which was complicated and lived in territory he wasn't ready to put words to yet. He gave her the answer that was also true but simpler. Because what's happening is wrong, and I'm in a position to do something about it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I would have fought for you, at the board level, if they'd given me the information." "I know," he said. "That's also why I'm telling you now instead of earlier, because fighting for me would have put you in a worse position than letting them think they'd succeeded." She studied him. "That's a very cold calculation." "You're not the only one who thinks like that," he said. Something shifted in her face then. Not a smile, but the precursor to one, the internal movement before the expression forms. She turned back to the screen. "Send me copies of everything." "Already done. Check your secure inbox." She looked at him sidelong. "You sent them before you came in here?" "I thought the conversation might go better if the decision was already made." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, too short, too controlled, but was the closest he'd heard from her. "Get some sleep," she said. "You're going to need it." He worked Friday through the following Thursday from his kitchen table, his laptop open next to Lucy's abandoned homework, and he did not tell Lucy what had happened beyond that he was working from home for a while. She accepted this with the equanimity she brought to most things, adapted her homework spot to the opposite end of the table, and began asking him questions about his work with a frequency that suggested she was either genuinely curious or testing whether he was okay, possibly both. "What are you writing?" she asked on Tuesday. "A report about how a company is run." "Is it a good company?" "It could be," he said. "What's wrong with it?" "Some people are trying to take it from someone who built it." She chewed on this. "That's not fair." "No." "Are you going to stop them?" "I'm trying." She looked at him for a moment with her serious face, the one that made her look briefly much older than 7. "You should stop them," she said, and went back to her homework, apparently satisfied that the matter was settled. He thought about that while he worked. Not the confidence of it, though that was something, to have your child believe plainly in your capacity to do a right thing, but the simplicity. Lucy's moral universe was not simple in the childish sense of naive. It was simple in the sense of being uncluttered. Something was wrong. It should be fixed. The person capable of fixing it should do so. She'd inherited some version of that from him, or he'd inherited it from somewhere, and it was the thing that had gotten him out of bed every morning for 4 years through grief and exhaustion, and the particular low-grade despair of feeling like you were always one misfortune away from the edge. You just kept going, because the thing in front of you needed doing. He worked from home for 9 days and built the cleanest version of the evidence file he could assemble. He organized it in 2 sections, a performance analysis and a governance conduct review, and wrote a 12-page executive summary that was careful and precise, and that he read 3 times to make sure it contained no interpretation that wasn't supported directly by data. It was the most careful piece of professional writing he'd ever done. During those 9 days, Victoria called him twice. Not emailed. Called. The first call was to tell him that Richard Colton had formally proposed a special board session to discuss leadership stability, which was being scheduled for the following month. The second was to tell him that Salas had pulled 2 more clients into direct conversations. After the second call, Evan sat for a while and then called her back. "The special session," he said. "Who chairs it?" "Gerald Morrow, board chairman." "What do you know about him?" A pause. "Gerald has been on the board since Pinnacle's 2nd year. He was Daniel's recommendation initially, but he and I have always had a functional relationship. He's methodical. He doesn't move quickly." "Is he fair?" "I believe so," she said, "in the way that people are fair when fairness doesn't cost them anything." "And if it costs them something?" "That I don't know," she said. He thought about this. "Victoria, I need you to do something." "What?" "I need you to request a meeting with Morrow, one-on-one, before the special session, not to discuss the agenda, not to make a case, just to talk to him the way you'd talk to someone you've worked with for 5 years, before Colton and Salas get to frame the conversation." Silence. "You think I can't do that?" she said. "I think you're capable of it," he said carefully. "I think it doesn't come naturally." Another pause, longer. "I was engaged," she said, and stopped. He waited. "Before the accident, I was different, not entirely, but in ways that mattered. I was better at the relational parts, the conversation that's not about the work. After everything that happened, I rebuilt myself around what I could control, and the relational parts." She stopped again. "I'm aware that the armor I put on is visible to people. I'm not always sure I know how to take it off for a specific purpose and put it back." "You took it off at Marco's," he said, "with Lucy." A long pause. "Lucy doesn't require anything from me. Neither does Morrow right now. That's the whole point." She was quiet for a moment. "What would I say to him?" "Tell him the truth, not the defense, just the truth. What you built, what it took, what you're proud of. Talk to him like a person, not like a CEO defending her record." Silence on the line. He could hear her breathing, just barely. "That's terrifying," she said. It was the most unguarded thing he'd ever heard her say, and the plainness of it hit him somewhere he didn't entirely expect. "I know," he said. "How are you certain it will work?" "I'm not," he said. "But I think Morrow is someone who will remember the conversation. And I think the conversation is better coming from you before the file comes from me." A long pause. Then, "All right. All right, you'll do it? Or all right, you're considering it?" "All right, I'll do it." A pause. "You're very difficult, you know." "You're not the first person to say so." I imagine not. He went back to the file after they hung up. He was tired in a way that had settled into his bones by that point. 9 days of concentrated work, Lucy's schedule to maintain, the low-level stress of no paycheck and depleting savings, and the particular anxiety of a plan that depended on variables he couldn't entirely control. He didn't sleep well. He woke at odd hours and lay in the dark thinking through the evidence structure, testing it against objections, looking for gaps. But there was something else there too, underneath the tiredness. Something he kept noticing and not quite naming. A sense that what he was doing mattered in a way that his work had not mattered for a long time. Not because it was dramatic, though it had become that, but because the thing he was protecting was real and worth protecting. A company built by someone who had refused to stop building it, even when everything conspired to make her stop. A business that existed because one person had gotten back up. He understood that impulse better than almost anything. He finished the evidence file on a Thursday night with Lucy asleep down the hall. He read the executive summary one final time, made 2 small edits to a paragraph about board communication timelines, and saved the final version. Then he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet apartment for a little while, with the kind of stillness that comes after you've done everything you can and are waiting to see if it was enough. Outside, March was beginning to show the first uncertain suggestions of spring. Not warm yet, not really, but the quality of the dark through the kitchen window had changed slightly, thinner than February, with a different texture to the air. He sat there until he was tired enough to actually sleep, which was later than it should have been, and then he went to bed. He'd sent the file to Victoria at 11:47. At 12:22, his phone lit up with a message from her. It said only, "I spoke with Morrow today." He listened. He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the nightstand and closed his eyes, and for the first time in several weeks, he slept without waking until morning. Gerald Morrow was 61 years old, and he had been in boardrooms long enough to know when something was wrong with the air in one. He'd felt it the moment the special session was proposed. The particular quality of urgency that wasn't really about urgency. The careful language that was doing too much work. The way Colton had framed the agenda in terms of fiduciary responsibility and long-term organizational health without once saying plainly what he meant. Gerald had been in business long enough to know that when people stopped saying plainly what they meant, they were usually doing something they couldn't defend if they said it plainly. He hadn't done anything with that feeling yet. He was methodical. Victoria had assessed him correctly. And he didn't move until he understood what he was moving toward. The conversation with Victoria had unsettled him, though not in the way she'd probably intended. She'd called his office on a Wednesday morning and asked if he had time to talk. And he'd expected the CEO to chairman conversation he'd had a version of before. Measured, strategic, the careful laying of groundwork. What he got instead was something different. She'd told him about the company, not the metrics, which he knew, but the texture of running it. The 18 months after Daniel Marsh left. The particular difficulty of rebuilding client confidence when the market wasn't sure if Pinnacle was going to survive the transition. She told him about a municipal client in the first year who had called to say they were putting the contract on pause to assess the situation, which was corporate language for, "We're watching to see if you fall apart," and how she'd driven to their offices. This was before, when she could drive, and sat across from their director of public works and said, "Tell me specifically what you need to see from us, and I will make sure you see it." The contract had not been paused. She'd told him other things. About the compliance framework she'd rebuilt from scratch in the first year because the one Daniel had designed had a structural flaw that would have created liability exposure across all municipal projects. About the staff she'd fought to keep when the company's finances were tight enough that the easy answer was cuts. About the things she'd sacrificed, not dramatically, not as a bid for sympathy, just as information stated plainly. Gerald had listened. He was good at listening in the way that powerful people either are or aren't, actually absorbing what was being said rather than waiting for his turn to speak. And what he heard, underneath the specific details, was a person telling him the truth without ornamentation because she'd decided that was the only play she had left. He'd thanked her and told her he'd be in touch. That evening, he went home and read every board document from the previous 18 months in a sequence he hadn't used before, not chronologically, but by author, grouped. He read everything Colton had circulated, then everything from Salas, then everything from Victoria's office. He read them like a person looking for a pattern rather than a summary, and by 10 o'clock he had found several things that made him sit very still in his study for a while before he went to bed. He called Evan Brooks the next morning. Evan was at the kitchen table with his laptop and a coffee that was still hot, which was unusual, when his phone rang with an unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. He answered on the third ring. "Mr. Brooks, this is Gerald Morrow. I'm the chairman of Pinnacle's board of directors." Evan set down his coffee. "Mr. Morrow, I understand you've assembled some materials related to Pinnacle's operational performance and board communications." A pause. "Victoria told you." "She did. She also told me you prepared those materials on your own time, after being separated from the company. That's an unusual thing to do." "Yes," Evan said. "I'd like to see what you have." Evan thought for a moment. "Can I ask what changed?" "I had a conversation with Victoria that I should have had a year ago," Morrow said, "and I read some things last night that I read differently than I did the first time. I'd like to verify my reading against whatever you have." "I can send it today." "I'd prefer to see it in person," Morrow said. "I find I understand documents better when I can ask questions of the person who made them." They met the following afternoon at Morrow's office, which was in a different part of the city, a law firm he'd retired from as a senior partner but maintained a consulting arrangement with. The office had the particular quality of spaces that have been occupied long enough to absorb the person in them. Books that had actually been read, a coffee machine that looked older than the desk, 2 chairs that had clearly been positioned by someone who spent a lot of time having conversations rather than delivering presentations. Evan brought the file on a laptop and a printed copy of the executive summary. He sat across from Morrow and walked him through it in the same sequence he'd used with Victoria, though the conversation was different. Morrow asked questions throughout, specific technical questions about the data sourcing, about the board communication log methodology, about how Evan had identified the pattern in Salas's client contact. They were the questions of someone who knew how evidence could be constructed to create a false impression, and was testing whether this evidence had been. Evan answered everything directly. When Morrow asked about a data point he'd derived rather than pulled directly from the system, he said so. When a methodology had a limitation, he named it. He did not sell the file. He just presented it. After 90 minutes, Morrow sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "Colton is not a bad person." Evan waited. "He's been on this board for 6 years and he's never acted in bad faith, as far as I've seen. He genuinely believes he's protecting the company. He sees Victoria's disability and he sees risk, and he's been in business long enough that his instinct is to manage what looks like risk." Morrow looked at him. "That doesn't make what he's doing right, but it's not the same as what Salas has been doing, and I think those two things need to be treated differently." "I agree," Evan said. Morrow seemed slightly surprised by the lack of pushback. "You're not arguing that Colton is acting in bad faith?" "No. The data I have on Colton shows a pattern of concern that was expressed through channels that were procedurally appropriate, even if the framing was unfair. What he did with the data request was pointed, but it wasn't illegitimate." Evan paused. "What Salas has been doing is different. He used the concern Colton was already expressing and built something on top of it that was not about protecting the company. It was about acquiring the company." Morrow nodded slowly. He looked at the printed summary for a moment. "The Hargrove contact. Direct client solicitation during an internal governance dispute. Framed as concern about leadership stability, which was information Salas had because he helped create the instability." "If I bring this to the full board," Morrow said, "Salas will argue that the materials were prepared by a terminated employee with a personal interest in the outcome." "I know. How do you respond to that?" "I respond that the data is verifiable independently, that none of it requires my interpretation to be damaging, and that the question isn't whether I have an interest, I clearly do, but whether the information is accurate." He met Morrow's eyes. "It is accurate. Every item in that file can be confirmed through Pinnacle's own systems by someone with no relationship to me at all." Morrow studied him. "Why did you do this? Honestly." Evan thought about it for a moment. "Because I watched someone run a company well and get ready to lose it, not because of anything she'd done wrong, but because of how she looks in a room." He paused. "That's worth doing something about." Morrow was quiet. Then, "I owe Victoria an apology." "That's between you and her," Evan said. "Yes." Morrow stood, which Evan took as the signal that the meeting was ending. He stood as well. Morrow extended his hand. "I'm going to need until the end of the week. The special session is scheduled for the 23rd. I'm going to move some things around before then. Whatever you need, Evan said. He drove home in the afternoon light thinking about very little, a kind of deliberate mental quiet, the thing he did when he'd done everything he could, and the outcome was no longer in his hands. He picked up Lucy from Pat Doherty's, which she was always slightly reluctant to leave because Pat had a cat named Biscuit that Lucy had a strong attachment to. In the car, she told him at length about a dream she'd had in which Biscuit had learned to talk and had used this ability primarily to ask for different food, which Evan found both funny and plausible. What would you do if you could talk to animals? He asked. She considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. I'd ask the birds what they're looking at when they sit on wires. They always look like they're thinking about something. Maybe they're not thinking about anything. Everyone's thinking about something, Lucy said, with the authority of a person who had never doubted this. The special board session was held on a Tuesday morning in the small conference room on the third floor of the Pinnacle building that Evan had helped arrange cabling in during his second week. He was not in the building. He was at the kitchen table, as he'd been for the past 12 days, with his laptop open and his phone face up. And he was doing something he rarely did during work hours, which was nothing. He'd made his coffee. He'd made Lucy's lunch for the next day out of habit. He sat and waited, which was the hardest thing. Victoria had told him the session was starting at 9. At 11:43, his phone buzzed with a message from her. Still going. We'll call after. He got up and walked to the window and looked at the street below. A woman was walking a dog that was clearly walking her. 2 kids on bikes. A delivery truck double-parked with its hazards on. The driver hauling boxes without any apparent urgency, indifferent to the cars building up behind him. He thought about the boardroom upstairs in the Pinnacle building and what was being said in it, and he let himself think it without trying to predict the outcome, because he'd learned over the past 4 years that prediction was largely a way of borrowing anxiety from a future that hadn't decided anything yet. His phone rang at 12:51. It's done, Victoria said. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard before. Not relief exactly, more like the particular exhaustion of someone who has been braced against something for a long time and has just been allowed to put it down. Tell me, he said. Morrow presented the governance review materials to the full board before Colton's agenda item was opened. He reframed the session entirely, turned it from a leadership stability discussion into a governance conduct review. A pause. It was very precise. He didn't accuse Colton of bad faith. He distinguished clearly between the concern Colton had been expressing and the use Salas had made of it. It was... She stopped. It was well done. What happened with Colton? He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked to see the performance comparison, the one that showed the company's actual metrics against industry benchmarks. Another pause. He read it for several minutes without saying anything. Then he said that he had not seen those numbers framed that way before, and that he thought he had been responding to an impression rather than an analysis. She stopped again. He apologized. To the board, and then directly to me. I wasn't prepared for it. How did you respond? I told him I understood that his concern had come from a place of care for the company, which I believe is true. She paused. It wasn't easy to say. No, Evan agreed. Salas attempted to reframe his client contacts as proactive relationship management. Morrow asked him to explain why client discussions about potential contract modifications during an internal governance dispute were initiated without CEO authorization or notification. Salas didn't have a satisfactory answer. He tried 2 different versions and neither of them held. A long pause. The board voted to remove him from his position effective immediately. Colton seconded the motion. Evan sat down. He hadn't realized he'd been standing. And the leadership proposal, he said, withdrawn. Formally, by Colton, before it was ever voted on. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. Morrow proposed instead a governance reform package, clear communication protocols, a formal CEO performance review structure with defined metrics, and a board composition review. She paused. He said that the board had been operating on impressions where it should have been operating on data, and that the company deserved better from them. That's honest. It was. A silence. Then, he also recommended expanding the COO role, which Pinnacle doesn't currently have. She stopped. When she spoke again, her voice was careful in the way of someone choosing exactly how to say something. He recommended it be offered to the person who had most recently demonstrated what the role required. Evan was quiet. He didn't name you directly, Victoria said. He was too careful for that. But there wasn't a person in the room who didn't understand who he meant. A pause. I would like to offer you the position formally, Chief Operating Officer. It was always a gap in the structure. I built this company the way a founder builds things, which is to say, I held everything myself because there was nobody I trusted enough to give any of it to. She stopped. I'm offering it to you because that's changed. He looked at the window. The street below was ordinary and unhurried. The city doing what cities do regardless of what's happening in boardrooms or kitchens 3 floors up. I need to know something first, he said. What? The role. What does it actually mean? Not the title. What are you actually giving me? She seemed to consider this as a serious question, which it was. The operational authority to act on behalf of the company without case-by-case approval, budget authority up to defined thresholds, vendor and client relationship management, internal process design. A pause. The space to do what you've been doing since October without having to work around me to do it. I wasn't working around you. You were, she said, but not unkindly. Carefully, and for good reasons, but you were. The structure should allow you to do the work without that. Another pause. And I need someone in that chair who I know won't leave when it gets complicated. You know that now, he said. I knew it in March, she said, when you came back to the building after Friday and sat in the parking lot doing work on your laptop because you didn't have a badge anymore, and I had to have Marcus come down and let you in. I needed the printer, Evan said. You needed the printer, she repeated, and there was something in her voice that was unmistakably warm, even filtered through the phone, even through all the layers she'd built. Yes, he said. I'll take the role. A pause. Good. Then, come in tomorrow. There's a lot to rebuild. He came in the next morning to find his access badge had already been reissued and left with Marcus, who handed it to him with the expression of a person who had been waiting to do this for some time. His desk had been moved to the office adjacent to Victoria's, not a symbolic gesture, but a practical one. The operations function needed to be proximate to the CEO's decision-making, and the previous layout hadn't reflected that. The move had apparently happened yesterday, after the board session, which meant Victoria had arranged it before she'd officially offered him the job. He mentioned this to her when he stopped in her doorway. The move needed to happen regardless, she said, not looking up from what she was reading. You were confident I'd say yes. I was confident that if you said no, the office would sit empty for a while, and then I'd figure out something else. She looked up. But yes, reasonably confident. He set up his workspace in about 20 minutes. He didn't have much because the things he'd accumulated over 6 months were mostly digital, and then went to find Marcus to get a briefing on what had happened operationally in the 12 days he'd been out. What he found was roughly what he'd expected. 3 vendor issues that had been sitting without decision, 2 client follow-ups that had gone unanswered, and a staffing question in the project management team that had been escalated 3 times and resolved by nobody. He spent the morning on those. In the afternoon, he had his first official meeting with Victoria in his new capacity, which felt different from the meetings they'd been having for 6 months, and also not different at all, because the dynamic between them had been pointing toward this for a while, and the title change was the system catching up to the reality. They worked until 6:30. When he was putting his coat on to leave, Victoria appeared in his doorway. The Hargrove remediation timeline, she said. I'm meeting with Denise Fujiwara on Thursday to reset it, he said. I'll brief you Friday. She nodded. She didn't move for a moment. Thank you, she said, for what you did. I want to make sure I've said it plainly. He looked at her. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, she said. I'm choosing to. A pause. You spent 12 days of your own time and a significant amount of your own money building a case that protected something that wasn't yours to protect. You did it without being asked and without any guarantee that it would matter. I want to say thank you clearly so that it's been said. He was quiet for a moment. It mattered to me, he said. That's why I did it. She looked at him with the direct, assessing look he knew well by now. The one that wasn't cold, he'd learned, but was simply how she processed things that came from the part of herself she guarded most carefully. He looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment, And the silence was not uncomfortable in the way that silences can be when something is unresolved. It was the other kind, the kind where two people are occupying the same space without anything needing to be fixed about it. "Go home," she said finally. "Your daughter's going to think you've been replaced." "She'd notice pretty quickly," he said. "The face," Victoria said, and there was the ghost of the suppressed smile again. He drove home in the April evening, thinking about the day with the unstructured attention he gave things when he wasn't trying to do anything with them yet. The board session, the offer, Victoria's face in the doorway when she said thank you, Morrow's quiet precision in a room full of people who had been operating on impressions. He picked up Lucy from Pat Doherty's. She came out with Biscuit in her arms, carrying the cat to the door with the confidence of someone who had been invited to do this, which Pat seemed unbothered by. "How was your day?" Lucy asked him, returning Biscuit with ceremony. "Good," he said. "Really good, actually." She looked at him. "You got your job back." "How did you know?" "You have the other face," she said. "The one when things are okay." He wasn't sure he knew he had that face, but he didn't doubt her. He buckled her in and pulled out of Pat's street and drove home through the April evening, which was still light at this hour, in a way that March hadn't been, the season finally making good on what it had been suggesting for weeks. He told Lucy that evening over dinner that he'd gotten a new position, a bigger one, and that he'd be going back to the office starting tomorrow. She received this with relief, barely concealed by the elaborately casual way she said, "Oh, okay," which told him she'd been worrying more than she'd let on. He made a note of that. He needed to get better at signaling to her when things were uncertain without letting the uncertainty swallow the household atmosphere. He hadn't managed it perfectly these past 12 days. He hadn't been terrible, but he hadn't been perfect. He also told her, in the simpler language appropriate to a 7-year-old, that the situation at Victoria's company had been resolved, that the people who had been causing trouble were gone, and that Victoria was still running the company. Lucy was eating her pasta when he said this, and she stopped chewing for a moment and looked at him with the particular expression she used when something mattered to her and she wanted to say the right thing. "Good," she said. "It's hers." "Yes." "Did she cry?" "No," he said, though he didn't entirely know this. "Victoria doesn't really—" "She does," Lucy said. "She just doesn't do it where people can see." He looked at his daughter. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm the same," she said simply, and went back to her pasta. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about Claire, and what she would have thought of their daughter at 7. This particular child, observant and certain and quietly building entire worlds on paper with streets named after things she loved. He thought about it without the usual weight, which happens sometimes now. Not grief's absence, but its change. The way it had slowly become something he could carry rather than something carrying him. After dinner, Lucy asked if they could invite Victoria to Marco's that Saturday. Not as a question requiring deliberation, just a logistical inquiry, the way she'd ask if they were getting more orange juice. "I'll ask her," he said. "Tell her don't ask her," Lucy said. "She says yes when it's a tell. That's very strategic." "I know," Lucy said, and carried her plate to the sink. He messaged Victoria that evening. Marco's Saturday at 6, Lucy's orders. He wasn't sure what response he expected. He got a reply 11 minutes later. "Tell Lucy I'll be there." He smiled at his phone in the kitchen, standing next to the sink, alone in the apartment while Lucy drew in the other room, and the smile had something in it that he recognized as happiness. Not the big kind, not the kind you announce, but the quiet daily kind that you build slowly from ordinary things, and that is, in the end, more durable than anything. The weeks that followed had a different texture from anything that had come before. Not easier, exactly. The work was substantial. The company had genuine rebuilding to do after the governance crisis, and the vacuum left by Salas's departure created operational gaps that took time to diagnose and fill. But the work had a direction to it now, and Evan and Victoria had found a working rhythm that was different in kind from what they'd had before. Less cautious, more direct. She still didn't explain herself when she didn't feel explanation was warranted, and he still brought her completed analysis rather than problems that needed her to solve, and those patterns served them both. But the space between them had changed. The distances she'd maintained, professional formality, the careful management of anything that might look like vulnerability, had compressed, not all at once, but steadily, like a tide coming in by degrees too small to watch, but impossible to miss when you looked up and found the shore was different than it had been. She began her rehabilitation program in late April. She mentioned it to Evan on a Wednesday afternoon, matter-of-factly, the way she mentioned most things. I've started working with a PT practice, 3 days a week. She was looking at a project schedule on her computer and did not look at him when she said it. I've been putting it off. I decided to stop putting it off. Okay, he said. He didn't ask what had changed. He thought he knew, and he thought she knew he knew, and asking would have made it too large. She looked at him then, just for a moment. It's going to be a long process, she said, and I'm probably going to be difficult to be around on the days when it's hard. You're already difficult to be around on hard days, he said. She considered this. Fair. I'll manage, he said. She turned back to her screen. I know you will, she said, and it was the simplest sentence and somehow also not simple at all. The Saturday dinners at Marco's had become, by May, a fixed point in all 3 of their weeks. Not explicitly agreed upon, just moved from optional to assumed somewhere along the way certain things become structural without anyone signing off on it. Lucy brought a new neighborhood map every week and walked Victoria through the design decisions with an earnestness that Victoria matched without condescension, asking real questions, pushing back on zoning choices, once producing a small sketch on a napkin to demonstrate a point about pedestrian flow that Lucy then incorporated into the next week's version and credited, she told Evan, to the expert. He watched them across a Marco's booth one evening in May, Victoria leaning slightly forward over Lucy's latest map, pointing at something, Lucy explaining with her hands, and felt something he didn't try to name or examine too closely, because it was the kind of thing that gets complicated when you look at it too hard. He just let it be there. What he knew was this. 6 months ago, he had been a man who got up every morning before 5 and drove to a job that kept the lights on and came home too tired to be fully present to the child who was the reason he'd gotten up in the first place. He had been surviving, which was not nothing. Surviving was work, and he'd done it without complaint. But it was not the same as building something, not the same as being somewhere that asked things of him and let him find out what he was actually capable of. He was finding out. Victoria was finding out too, in her own way, in the physical therapy room 3 mornings a week, and in the boardroom where she now ran meetings differently. Not harder, but with more room in them, more willingness to let other people's perspectives land before she moved on. She was not a different person. She was the same person with more of herself available, which was not the same thing at all. One evening in late May, after a Saturday dinner, he drove her back to her car in the Pinnacle lot, the way he always did. Lucy had fallen asleep in the back seat, which happened sometimes on the drive back if it was late enough. He pulled into the lot and stopped, and Victoria gathered her things, and before she got out she said quietly so as not to wake Lucy, "I want to say something." He waited. "I know what the last few months cost you. Not just the 12 days, the whole thing, the risk of it. I know what it means to do what you did when you have a child depending on you." She looked at him in the dark of the car, and her face had the expression he'd seen only rarely, the unguarded one, the one she usually put away before it could be seen. "I don't take it lightly. I want you to know that." "I know you don't," he said. "I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not good at certain things. I'm working on it. But I want you to know that whatever this is—" She gestured slightly, meaning the car, the parking lot, the kid asleep in the back, the company 3 floors up, all of it. "I don't take any of it lightly." He looked at her. "Neither do I," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she normally held anyone's. Then she nodded once. The small, precise nod he knew meant that something had been settled, and got out of the car. He watched her drive out of the lot. In the back seat, Lucy slept on, entirely unaware. He sat there alone for a moment in the quiet of the car. Outside, May was fully itself now. The air warm and soft through the cracked window, the parking lot lit by the kind of pale artificial light that makes everything look slightly unreal. He thought about what she'd said and what he'd said, and the small gap between those things and what they hadn't said yet. That gap would close on its own. He wasn't in a hurry. He started the car and drove his daughter home through the warm May night, and the city moved past outside the windows, ordinary and irreplaceable, the way the city always was, and would be, regardless of what happened inside the small human lives it contained. Summer came in the way summers do when you've stopped bracing against things, Not as relief exactly, but as a shift in the quality of ordinary days, something looser in the air, the evenings lasting longer than you remember from the year before. Pinnacle Access Solutions signed its 8th municipal contract in June. Evan processed the paperwork on a Tuesday morning with the same attention he gave every contract, cross-referencing the scope definitions against the compliance framework, and flagging 2 clauses for legal review before routing the signature package to Victoria. She reviewed it that afternoon, made one change to the indemnity language that was correct and that he should have caught himself, and signed it. He noted the missed clause and didn't make the same mistake in the next contract, which came 6 weeks later. That was how the work went. It didn't get easier so much as it got more familiar, and familiar meant that errors became smaller and recoveries became faster, and the space between a problem appearing and a solution existing compressed to something manageable. Evan had built the operations function the way he built most things, methodically, without announcing it, so that by midsummer Pinnacle had documented processes where it had previously had informal understandings, vendor accountability structures where it had previously had handshakes, and a coordination rhythm between operations and the CEO's office that didn't require either of them to chase the other. Victoria noticed and didn't say so, which was how he knew. What she did say, on a Thursday afternoon in July, when he dropped the Q2 operational summary on her desk and turned to leave, was, "Sit down." He sat. She was looking at the summary. Client retention this quarter, 94%, up from 89 in Q1. The Kellner contract. Renewed. They added 2 new properties to the scope. She set the summary down. She was looking at him in the particular way she had, not evaluating anymore, or not only evaluating, something underneath the assessment that had been there for a while and that neither of them had put language to yet. The board wants to discuss a growth strategy for Q4, she said. I know. I've been building the operational capacity model. I know you have, she said. That's not what I'm saying. He waited. I'm saying that a year ago this company was preparing to lose its CEO, its operations function, and 2 clients, and now it's preparing a Q4 growth strategy. She paused. I want to make sure that's been said. He looked at her. It's been said. Good. She picked the summary back up, which usually meant the conversation was over. Then she said, without looking up, Saturday. Marco's. I'll drive myself. It was the first time she'd said that. He understood what it meant. The therapy had been producing results for weeks, incremental and hard-won, and she'd been driving again for a month, but she hadn't navigated the Marco's route independently yet. It was a small thing, and not a small thing. I'll tell Lucy to expect you at 6, he said. Tell her I want to see the new map. She's been waiting for someone to ask, he said. The map Lucy brought that Saturday was different from the others. It was larger. She'd taped 2 sheets together, and the geography was more complex, with a river running through the middle of it and a bridge that had been drawn and erased and redrawn until the paper was slightly thin in that spot. The neighborhood had a name, Clearfield. There were parks, a school with a playground detail, a farmer's market marked with tiny stalls, and in the northwest corner, on a street labeled Hale Brooks Avenue, 2 houses side by side with a shared garden between them. Victoria looked at the map for a long time. Lucy was watching her with the straight-on attention she gave things she cared about. The bridge, Victoria said finally. The span looks too narrow for the traffic volume you'd get from these residential zones. I know, Lucy said. I couldn't figure out how to draw a wider one. May I? Victoria held out her hand and Lucy gave her the pencil. Victoria widened the bridge span with 3 precise lines and added a pedestrian walkway along one side. Like that. Lucy examined it. That's better. She took the pencil back and added a railing. Did you see the street? I did. It's both your names, Lucy said, because you both belong there. The table was quiet for a moment. Evan was looking at the menu he'd had memorized for 8 months. Victoria was looking at the map. That's very thoughtful, Victoria said, and her voice had the careful quality it took on when something had landed somewhere unguarded. I know, Lucy said. I thought about it a lot. She picked up her own menu with the air of someone who has delivered important information and is now prepared to move on. I'm getting the gnocchi. Obviously, Victoria said, and this time the smile came all the way through. Not the ghost of one, not the suppressed precursor, but an actual smile, full and a little uncertain the way things are when they've been out of practice, and Evan saw it and looked back at his menu and said nothing, because some things are better witnessed without comment. He'd been thinking about what to say for weeks, not rehearsing. He'd learned enough about himself to know that rehearsal made him worse, made the words come out in the careful, constructed shape of prepared remarks, rather than the irregular shape of something true. He just thought about it, the way he thought about most things, carrying it around with him through ordinary days until it found its own form. It found its form on a Wednesday evening in August. He'd stayed late. Victoria had stayed late. This was not unusual. The building had emptied by 7, and they'd kept working independently, the particular companionable quiet of two people who have been in the same space long enough that the silence between them doesn't require management. Around 8:15 he heard the sound of her wheelchair in the hallway, and then a few minutes later he heard something different, the sound of footsteps. Careful, deliberate footsteps, and the soft tap of a cane. He got up from his desk. She was at the end of the hallway, moving toward the large window that overlooked the street below. Walking. Not fluidly. There was effort in every step, the visible effort of someone doing something that didn't yet come without thought, each foot placed with intention. She wasn't using the wheelchair. She had a forearm cane on the left side and her right hand touching the wall at intervals, not gripping, just maintaining orientation. She reached the window and stopped, and she stood there looking out at the street below with the particular stillness of someone who has just done something that required everything they had. Evan stood in the hallway and didn't say anything. After a moment, she said without turning, "You can stop pretending you're not there." "I wasn't pretending," he said. "I was just not interrupting." She turned around slowly, and the mechanics of turning were still the careful, deliberate version. Not graceful, not the way it would eventually be, but real. She looked at him. Her face had the same expression it had at the window. Something that wasn't pride exactly. More like the complicated feeling of having made it to a place you doubted you'd reach, and finding that you feel both satisfied and aware that there's still a long way to go. "The PT says I'll have better distance in 3 to 4 months, she said. "Right now I can manage the length of the hallway and back." "That's the length of the hallway more than 6 months ago," he said. "Yes." She held his gaze. "Don't make it a metaphor." "I wasn't going to." "You were thinking about it." "Maybe a little," he admitted. She almost smiled. She was still standing, and he could see the effort it took, the way her weight was distributed, the steadiness she was imposing on herself through will and practice. He walked down the hallway and stopped a few feet from her, close enough to be present without being intrusive, which was a distance he'd spent a year learning. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. "Not about work," he said. She looked at him. The careful, unreadable look, except that he could read it now, or enough of it. He could see the thing underneath the composure, the wariness that wasn't mistrust but history, the particular caution of someone who had been left by someone they trusted at the worst possible time and had rebuilt themselves entirely around the certainty that they wouldn't be in that position again. He saw it clearly, and he held her gaze through it. "I know what I am to this company," he said. "I know what the last year has been in terms of work. I'm not confused about that, and I'm not talking about that." He paused. "I'm talking about Saturday evenings at Marco's and the Hargrove framing conversation, and 12 days at my kitchen table and what Lucy put on that map tonight. I'm talking about what's actually been happening." She was very still. "I'm not asking you for anything right now," he said. "I just want you to know that I see it, what this has been. I didn't want to keep pretending I didn't, because I think you deserve someone who says the thing instead of waiting to see if you'll say it first." Silence. "You're right that I would have waited," she said finally. "Indefinitely. I know." She stopped. "I'm aware that's a flaw." "It's not a flaw," he said. "It's what happens when someone leaves the week after a surgery. You learn to protect the position. I understand that." She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her face. Not collapse, nothing that dramatic, just a slight release of something she'd been holding. "I don't know how to do this without being afraid of it," she said. "I want you to know that going in." "I know that too," he said. "I've been watching you be afraid of things and do them anyway for a year." She looked at him. "That's a very Evan Brooks thing to say. Is that good or bad?" "I haven't decided yet," she said. But the way she said it, The particular dry precision, the eye contact, was its own answer, and he let it be that. He walked her back to her office and waited while she settled, not hovering, just present. Before he got his coat, she said his name. Just his name, the way she'd said it that night in the office when she'd needed him to understand something. First name. With the weight she only gave things she meant completely. Evan, he stopped. I'm glad you came back, she said. After Friday. I know I didn't say it at the time in any way that was sufficient. You expanded my system access, he said. That's not the same as saying it. No, he agreed, but it was very you. She looked at him with the full unguarded expression, the one that Lucy had apparently seen from the beginning and that had taken him longer to find. Good night, she said. Good night, he said, and meant more by it than he usually did. Fall arrived the way it always does in that part of the country. Suddenly, between 1 week and the next, the heat gone without ceremony, the mornings requiring a jacket, the Maples starting their annual argument about color. Lucy started second grade, then third, a year turning over the way years do when you're paying attention to the days rather than the calendar. One ordinary thing after another that adds up without your noticing until you look back and the view is different. Pinnacle Access Solutions was named, in October, to a regional business journal's list of the most respected specialty consulting firms in the state. The article mentioned revenue growth, client retention, and a governance restructuring that had strengthened the company's leadership foundation. The journalist's phrase, careful and accurate, covering a story that was more specific than the language allowed. Victoria was quoted. The photo showed her standing at the window of her office, the forearm cane visible, her expression the composed one she gave cameras, which was different from but related to all her other expressions. Evan read the article at his desk and then put it away and went back to work because there was a vendor negotiation to finish before Thursday. He and Victoria did not announce anything. There was nothing to announce in the formal sense. What happened between them happened in the accumulated space of ordinary time, in the work they did, in the dinners they shared, and the specific quality of the silence between them that had changed and changed again until it was something neither of them had a word for, but both understood. Lucy, when asked by Pat Doherty one afternoon if Victoria was her dad's girlfriend, had apparently said, "She's more than that, I think, but I don't know the word for it yet." Pat had told Evan this, warmly, over the fence one Saturday morning, and Evan had stood there with his coffee and decided his daughter had put it correctly. What he knew was this. He was not the same man who had set an alarm for 4:47 in the dark and made himself get up because the alternative was not surviving. He was still tired sometimes. He still made mistakes at work and caught them at odd hours. He still wrote notes on the kitchen table for mornings when he had to leave early, and he still drove the same route to the office he'd been driving for a year and knew every light and every pothole. He was still imperfect in all the ways he'd always been imperfect. Impatient occasionally, too, inside his own thinking, sometimes not always good at saying things in the moment they should be said. But he was building something. That was the difference. Not just maintaining, not just surviving the distance between one hard thing and the next. Actually building. The company, the life. The specific texture of days that had people in them he hadn't expected and couldn't have planned for. Victoria was still difficult to work for, in the ways she'd always been. She still moved the line. She still expected you to find the gap yourself. She still said better where other people would have said excellent, and held things to standards that required genuine effort to meet. The difference was that Evan had stopped finding this draining and started finding it clarifying. The particular relief of a person who has spent too long in rooms where the feedback was either noise or silence, finally being in a room where it was signal. She was honest about work in a way that made him better at it, and she was learning, with difficulty and occasional backsliding, to be honest about other things too. She had bad days with the therapy, which she didn't talk about directly, but which showed up in the specific quality of her silence on certain afternoons. On those days he didn't ask and she didn't explain, and he made sure the operational questions that reached her were handled at his level, where he could handle them. He didn't do this to protect her. He did it because it was his job, and because on his bad days, the anniversaries, the mornings when the absence of Claire was for some reason louder than usual, she did the same for him without comment or ceremony. That was the thing nobody told you about the people who were actually built for the long run. It wasn't that they were always strong, it was that they knew how to hold the space when you weren't. One evening in November, almost exactly a year after the December dinner that had started everything, The three of them were at Marco's. Lucy had a new map. She'd abandoned Clearfield temporarily in favor of an elaborate coastal town she'd named Port Quiet, which had a working harbor and a lighthouse and a street called November Lane. She was explaining the harbor logistics to Victoria, who was engaged in the explanation with the specific attention she gave Lucy's maps, not humoring her, actually thinking about them. Evan was watching them, not pretending to look at the menu, just watching. He thought about what loyalty looked like when it cost you everything, which was the question the story had started with. He'd had an answer in March, when he was at his kitchen table building an evidence file with no paycheck, and Lucy asleep down the hall. But that answer had been about a specific act, a specific decision, and what he understood now, a year in a booth at Marco's on a November evening, was that the specific act was not really the point. The specific act was just the visible version of something that had been accumulating since October, since a hospital parking lot and a job posting and a letter of offer that arrived on a Monday. Loyalty at that cost wasn't really about the cost. It was about what you'd decided, quietly and without ceremony, mattered enough to protect. The cost was just how you found out you'd actually decided it. He'd decided, somewhere in those early months of early mornings and vendor calls and cross-referencing spreadsheets and dinners in red booth restaurants, that Victoria and what she'd built were worth his best effort. Not because she was perfect, she was not, and not because the situation was clean, it never was, but because there was something true and real in what she'd made and what she'd survived and what she was still making, and true and real things deserved people willing to stand in front of them. Lucy had known this before he'd articulated it. She'd known from the first dinner, from the first conversation about wheelchair speed and her father's back-of-the-chair sound. Children are not innocent in the sense of unknowing. They know a great deal. They're innocent in the sense of being uncluttered. Lucy had looked at Victoria across a table and seen a sad smile and a person who deserved better than she'd gotten, and she'd decided, with the simple authority of a 7-year-old who notices everything, that they should keep showing up until the sadness had some company. Which they had. Which it did. Victoria looked up from the map and caught Evan watching her and held his gaze for a moment with the expression that had no name yet but was his, that he'd learned to read as surely as anything he'd ever read. The look that said she knew exactly where she was and had decided, carefully and against her own instinct for caution, that it was where she intended to stay. He looked back at her the same way. "The harbor," Lucy said, reclaiming their attention. "Are you listening? There are logistics." "We're listening," Victoria said, turning back to the map. "Both of us," Evan said. Lucy gave them the brief evaluative look of a child who suspects she's missing something between adults, but is prepared to let it go in the interest of harbor logistics. "Okay," she said, and picked up her pencil. "So the lighthouse has to be on this side because of the way the current runs, and the boats need—" She talked. They listened. The restaurant moved around them in its ordinary way. Other tables, other conversations, the breadbasket arriving without being asked for, the particular warmth of a room in November when the cold is outside. Later, Evan would not be able to tell you exactly what was said or what Lucy's solution to the harbor current problem was. What he would remember was the feeling of it, specific and unrepeatable, the way good evenings are. The three of them in a booth at Marco's, a map on the table between them, the city going about its business just outside the window, and the quiet ongoing fact of being somewhere that felt, without exaggeration or announcement, like home. That was all. That was everything. The things worth having rarely arrive any other way. Not in a single moment that changes everything, but in 100 ordinary evenings that you didn't know were building towards something until you look up and find you're already there.